Imagine a dark, cold dungeon in Florence, Italy. The year is 1513. A man is hanging from the ceiling by his wrists, his arms twisted behind his back, slowly dislocating from their sockets. His body screams in agony, but he refuses to confess to a crime he did not commit. This is the strappado, a brutal form of torture designed to break the human spirit. He endures this torment multiple times. When they finally let him down, his shoulders are permanently dislocated, his body broken. He is released from prison, stripped of his wealth, his status, and exiled from the city he loved. He is a ruined man. But instead of dying in obscurity, this man, Niccolò Machiavelli, goes home, sits down at his desk, and begins to write. He writes a short book that will forever change the course of human history. It is called The Prince, and it becomes the most infamous, most feared, and most misunderstood treatise on power ever conceived. For centuries, the world has read The Prince as a cold, cynical instruction manual for tyrants. We are told that Machiavelli was an evil genius, a psychopath who taught rulers to lie, cheat, and murder to maintain power. The very word Machiavellian has become a synonym for ruthless, calculating evil. But on Deconstructing Minds, we don't accept simple labels. We perform psychological autopsies. What if the prince wasn't a blueprint for evil, but a desperate, tortured cry for survival? What if it was written not by a detached strategist, but by a broken man suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder? Today, we are deconstructing the ultimate teacher of evil. We are going to explore how Machiavelli's personal trauma, the betrayal, the prison, the torture, transformed him from an idealistic patriot into a cynical observer of human cruelty. Brace yourselves as we open The Prince and find not a monster, but a man who saw the abyss and then gave us a map of how to survive it. To understand the Machiavelli of The Prince, we must first understand the idealistic, almost naive young man he once was. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469 into a time of incredible political volatility. Florence was a vibrant, brutal republic, a city of unparalleled artistic genius, but also a snake pit of political intrigue, assassinations, and constant warfare between rival families and city-states. Young Machiavelli was not a soldier or a poet. He was a civil servant. For 14 years, he worked for the Florentine Republic as a diplomat and military strategist. He was an ardent patriot. He loved Florence with every fiber of his being, believing in its republican ideals of civic virtue, liberty, and the rule of law. He saw himself as a servant of the people, dedicated to protecting Florence from the constant threats of powerful, corrupt families like the Medici and ruthless foreign invaders. This was a man who believed in the ideal of civic virtue. He saw himself as a practitioner of good governance. He traveled across Europe, meeting kings, popes, and generals, always trying to secure Florence's freedom. He organized a citizen militia, arguing that a republic's defense should be in the hands of its own people, not unreliable mercenaries. But the world he loved so much was about to turn on him with unimaginable cruelty. In 1512, the powerful Medici family, whom Machiavelli had spent his entire career fighting, returned to Florence with the backing of the Pope and a Spanish army. The Florentine Republic collapsed in a single bloody day. Psychologically, this was a total ego annihilation for Machiavelli. His entire identity, his life's work, and his deepest ideals were utterly crushed. He was dismissed from his post, accused of conspiracy, and his once proud name was dragged through the mud. Everything he believed in, the power of virtue, the triumph of justice, the strength of the Republic, proved to be a fragile illusion. This wasn't just a political defeat, it was a profound existential trauma. The idealist died in 1512. The cynical survivor, the Machiavellian, was about to be born, forged in the fires of betrayal and humiliation. In February 1513, the nightmare became a reality. Machiavelli's name was found on a list of suspected conspirators plotting against the newly restored Medici regime. He was entirely innocent, but in the paranoid world of Renaissance politics, suspicion was enough. He was arrested, thrown into the dark, damp dungeons of the Bargello, and subjected to the strappado. The strappado was not just a method of interrogation, it was a psychological weapon designed to strip a human being of their dignity and physical autonomy. Machiavelli's hands were bound behind his back, attached to a rope thrown over a pulley in the ceiling. He was hoisted high into the air, his entire body weight hanging from his internally rotated shoulders. And then the torturer dropped him. He didn't hit the ground. The rope was snapped tight just inches above the floor, sending a violent, agonizing shockwave through his body, violently dislocating his shoulder joints. He endured this drop 6 times. The pain was so blinding, it caused prisoners to hallucinate, to confess to anything, or simply to die from the shock. But Machiavelli did not confess. He endured the agony in silence. He even wrote sarcastic sonnets to Giuliana de' Medici from his cell, using dark humor as a psychological shield against the terror of his situation. Eventually, due to a general amnesty, he was released. But the man who walked out of the Bargello was not the man who had entered. His arms were crippled, but his mind had undergone a far more terrifying transformation. Psychologically, Machiavelli had experienced traumatic disillusionment. The strappado taught him a brutal, visceral lesson that all his years of studying philosophy had not. Virtue does not stop a falling rope. Good intentions do not protect you from men with power. He realized that the world is not governed by justice, morality, or God. It is governed by force, fear, and leverage. His famous philosophy, that the ends justify the means, was not born out of psychopathy. It was born in the torture chamber. It was the hyper-vigilant realization of a trauma survivor. To survive in a world of monsters, you must understand how monsters think. Following his release, Machiavelli was banished to his small, impoverished farm in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, outside of Florence. Stripped of his power, he spent his days in the dirt, catching birds, chopping wood, and arguing with local butchers over pennies just to keep his family fed. For a man whose entire identity was built on statecraft and international diplomacy, this was a living death. But every evening, he engaged in a bizarre, heartbreaking psychological ritual. In a famous letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, Machiavelli described what he did when the sun went down. He would take off his mud-covered peasant clothes, he would carefully wash himself, and then, alone in his modest farmhouse, he would put on his magnificent, formal ambassadorial robes, the garments of his past, the garments of his destroyed identity. Dressed as a powerful diplomat, he would sit at his desk and write. This ritual is a staggering display of identity foreclosure and dissociation. He couldn't accept his new reality, so he engaged in a nightly cosplay to resurrect the ghost of who he used to be. And it was in these lonely, desperate hours that he wrote The Prince. Historians say The Prince was essentially a job application. Machiavelli dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, the very family that had destroyed the Republic, ruined his life, and tortured him in the dungeon. Why would he do this? On Deconstructing Minds, we view this through the lens of trauma bonding and Stockholm syndrome. When a person's life is completely destroyed by an all-powerful abuser, the psyche sometimes performs a desperate maneuver to regain control. It tries to become useful to the abuser. Machiavelli was intellectually seducing his torturers. He was saying, "Look at my mind. Look at how brilliant I am. You have the power, but I have the knowledge of how to keep it. Please, let me back in." He wasn't an evil mastermind teaching tyrants how to rule. He was a desperate, traumatized, unemployed father, writing a manual on cruelty because he knew that cruelty was the only language the Medici understood. He abandoned his republican morals and adopted the psychology of the oppressor just to survive. The Prince is not a manifesto of evil. It is the ultimate psychological tragedy of a broken man trying to buy back his stolen life. After his torture and exile, Machiavelli began to understand power not through abstract ideals, but through raw, visceral survival. In The Prince, he famously advises rulers to combine the qualities of the lion and the fox. The lion, he argued, knows how to fight off wolves. The fox knows how to avoid traps. A good ruler must be both. On Deconstructing Minds, we see this not just as political advice, but as a profound psychological blueprint for a fractured self. Machiavelli was advising rulers to split their own psyche into two contradictory parts. The lion is the brute force, the courage, the willingness to inflict pain without hesitation. This was the strength he lacked in prison, the strength that could have prevented the Medici's return. This was the part of him that wanted revenge. The fox is the cunning, the deceit, the manipulation, the ability to anticipate traps. This was the intellectual skill he used to navigate the political snake pit, the skill that allowed him to survive torture by writing sonnets. Psychologically, Machiavelli was projecting his own internal conflict. He desperately wanted to be the lion, the powerful, decisive leader who could save Florence, but his experience in the dungeon taught him that he was, perhaps, more of a fox, a clever survivor who could only navigate power through cunning and words. This theory of the lion and the fox is Machiavelli's attempt to resolve his own identity crisis in the aftermath of trauma. He taught rulers to be emotionally detached, to make decisions based on cold calculation rather than sentiment. This was his emotional armor. He stripped politics of all morality because morality had failed him. It had led him to prison, to torture, and to exile. He didn't just advocate for these traits, he showed us how to cultivate them in a world where virtue is punished and ruthlessness is rewarded. The Prince is a guide to mastering the dark side of human nature, not because it's inherently good, but because it's fundamentally necessary to survive when your world has crumbled. He designed a psychology for rulers who, like himself, had seen the abyss. Niccolò Machiavelli died in 1527 at the age of 58. Despite writing the most influential book on power in history, he never regained a position of influence. The Medici family, to whom he had so desperately pleaded for a job, mostly ignored him. He died in obscurity, a broken, unemployed patriot, still obsessed with the mechanics of a power he could never quite grasp. His greatest work, The Prince, was only published posthumously in 1532. And that's when his true, dark legacy began. On Deconstructing Minds, our autopsy of Machiavelli reveals a chilling truth. The monster is not born, it is made by the monsters it fights. Machiavelli was not an evil man by nature. He was an idealist who was utterly shattered by trauma, torture, and betrayal. His Machiavellian theories, the ruthless pragmatism, the advice to lie, cheat, and kill, were not the product of a demonic mind. They were the trauma response of a man who realized that virtue gets you nothing but a stretch on the strappado. He taught us that morality is a luxury that only the weak can afford. He taught us that power is a cruel game, and if you don't play to win, you will be destroyed. He taught us that human nature is fundamentally selfish and driven by fear, and any ruler who forgets this will fall. Machiavelli leaves us with a terrifying, timeless question. In a world of wolves, is it truly virtuous to be a lamb? Or does true wisdom lie in understanding the nature of the wolf? He didn't just write a book, he gave humanity a mirror, a dark, unforgiving mirror that reflects not what we wish to be, but what we are, and what we are willing to do to survive. He was a defeated man who became an immortal symbol of the very power he could never truly reclaim.